The schoolhouse door hung askew on its leather hinges, splintered wood groaning against the prairie wind that drove sheets of rain through every gap and crack. Black Wolf pressed his shoulder against the warped planks, feeling the building shudder with each gust that threatened to tear it from its stone foundation. Water cascaded through the broken roof, pooling on the wooden floor, where 30-odd souls huddled around flickering oil lamps like moths drawn to dying flames. At 30 years old, the Cheyenne warrior bore the accumulated scars of a hard frontier life, a jagged white line along his jaw, from a cavalry saber calloused hands that had known both weapons and tools, and dark eyes that catalogued every shadow and movement. Tonight, he wore his eagle feather war bonnet, reserved for moments when death circled close enough to count its teeth, ceremonial donned only for the gravest fights. The Prairie River had burst its banks with the fury of divine retribution, transforming Ghost Hollow into a drowning maze of submerged streets and floating debris. Chicken coops, fence posts, and the bloated corpse of Henderson's prize bull drifted past the schoolhouse windows in a macabre parade of destruction. "They're coming through the cottonwoods," whispered a voice from the darkness. Winona emerged from behind a stack of salvaged grain sacks, her buckskin vest dark with moisture, and her Winchester .73 Model 1873 rifle cradled in capable hands. 25 years of frontier existence had honed her into something between woman and weapon, lean as a whip, quick as prairie lightning, with the kind of beauty that came from competence rather than powder and paint. Mud streaked her high cheekbones, and her black braids hung heavy with rain. Beside her stood Greta, the German immigrant, whose medical knowledge had made her invaluable during the flood's aftermath. At 28, she possessed the steady hands and unflappable demeanor that meant the difference between life and death in childbirth or surgery. Her simple gray dress was torn at the shoulder and stained with blood from the wounded she'd treated, but her blue eyes remained alert and determined. On the teacher's scarred oak desk, water dripped steadily onto a torn ledger page covered in meticulous script. Beside it, a mud-caked Colt Single-Action Army 1873 revolver caught the lamplight like an accusation made manifest. Both items seemed to pulse with menace in the storm's intermittent illumination. Through the cracked window glass, Black Wolf counted 5 riders moving through the swollen creek with methodical precision. Their leader sat his horse with familiar arrogance, and recognition struck Black Wolf like a physical blow to the chest. Wade Carr, the man who'd saved his life during a Sioux raid 15 years past, back when they'd ridden together as young fortune-seekers in the Black Hills. Now, Carr wore Bell's brand, and their shared history meant nothing against territorial politics and blood money. Choose now. Black Wolf set his voice cutting through the wind's howl like a blade through silk. Run with me, or stay and hang for crimes you never committed. Lightning split the sky with biblical wrath, illuminating the flooded street in stark white detail. In that frozen moment, all 3 saw their future written in the approaching riders' faces, not justice, but the kind of territorial law that bent to serve powerful men's interests. The river chose that instant to surge higher, driving a massive grain bin through the doorway with the grinding sound of breaking timber. Brown water rushed in behind it, rising to their ankles in heartbeats and bringing the smell of death and dissolution. The back window, Black Wolf commanded, grabbing the ledger page and tucking it inside his shirt against his ribs. Move! They flowed toward escape like water finding its level 3 people bound by circumstance into an alliance that would either save them all or damn them together. Black Wolf shouldered the warped window frame upward, while Winona snatched the revolver from its resting place. Greta clutched her leather medical satchel, the tools of her trade, too precious to abandon to flood or fire. The drop to sodden earth below was treacherous, but remaining inside meant certain death by rope or bullet. Black Wolf went first, landing hard and sucking mud that tried to claim his moccasins. He found purchase on submerged stones, and turned to catch the women, his wounded shoulder already beginning to throb. Winona swung through the opening with fluid grace, her scout's training evident in the controlled way she absorbed the impact. She landed in a crouch beside him, already scanning for threats with the Winchester held ready. Greta hesitated at the window's edge, staring down at the churning mire that would ruin her shoes and likely her only good dress. The building groaned ominously as another wave struck its foundation, timbers creaking like old bones under stress. "Trust me," Black Wolf called, extending his arms toward her. She closed her eyes and dropped. He caught her around the waist, their bodies pressed together as he absorbed her weight and forward momentum. For a heartbeat that stretched beyond natural time, their faces were inches apart, breath mingling in the cold rain, while her hands gripped his shoulders through wet fabric. "Safe," she whispered, but made no immediate move to step away from his embrace. Winona materialized at Black Wolf's elbow, pressing the Colt's grip into his palm, with fingers that brushed his knuckles longer than necessity required. Their eyes met as his hand closed over the weapon, and something deeper than words passed between them, understanding commitment and the recognition of chosen loyalty. "They've found nothing inside," Winona reported, cocking her head toward the sound of splintering furniture from within the schoolhouse. "But they won't stay fooled long." Black Wolf checked the revolver's cylinder by touch, 5 rounds, loaded one chamber empty beneath the hammer for safety. Insufficient firepower against professional killers, but it would have to suffice until they could reach better ground or find additional weapons. He gestured toward the swollen creek behind the building, now a raging torrent, but offering the only concealment between their position and the open prairie beyond town. Behind them, angry voices rose over the storm as Bell's men discovered the empty refuge. They ran through ankle-deep water feet, sliding on treacherous stones while rifle shots cracked like breaking branches. A bullet whined past Black Wolf's ear to punch splinters from a fence post, the sound sharp and final in the night air. "This way," he called, angling toward a stand of cottonwoods where the creek bent around higher ground that might offer temporary sanctuary. Greta stumbled, her city-made shoes no match for the slick terrain underfoot. Without breaking stride, Black Wolf caught her elbow in his free hand, his grip firm, but gentle enough to avoid bruising. She looked up at him with something approaching wonder-kindness from a Cheyenne warrior hadn't featured in her expectations of frontier life. They reached the trees as another shot split the night, this one close enough to spray Winona's legs with mud and creek water. She dropped to one knee behind a cottonwood's thick trunk, working the Winchester's lever with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to shoot before she could properly read. "How many cartridges?" Black Wolf asked, taking cover behind an adjacent tree. "Enough to make them think twice about charging," she replied, settling the rifle's stock against her shoulder. "Question is whether they value Bell's gold more than their own lives." Through the driving rain, they could see their pursuers spreading out in a classic envelopment pattern designed to prevent escape while minimizing their own exposure to return fire. 5 men against 3. But the attackers had to be cautious about losing horses or riders in the treacherous footing. "Wade Carr," Black Wolf said, recognizing the lead rider's silhouette against the stormlit sky. "Bell's right hand and my former partner in better days." Winona's eyebrows rose with interest. "Former partner in what?" "Prospecting. Before the wars made honest work impossible, and some men chose easier paths to wealth." His voice carried the weight of old disappointments and broken trust. The first shot came from Carr's position, a ranging round that kicked up mud between their feet. The message was unmistakable: surrender now, or die where you stand. Black Wolf's response was equally clear. The Colt bucked in his hand muzzle flames, stabbing through darkness toward the attackers' positions. One of Carr's men yelped and clutched his shoulder, tumbling from his saddle into the flood with a splash that was swallowed by wind and rain. "Still quick as ever, old friend." Carr's voice carried across the water with mocking familiarity. "But you're outnumbered and outgunned. Send out those women, and maybe I'll let you live long enough to see sunrise." "Counteroffer," Black Wolf called back. "Ride away now, and I won't have to explain to Belle how you let us slip through your fingers." Carr's laughter was harsh and without humor. "Belle's beyond caring about explanations. Took poison in his cell rather than face federal charges. His nephew Marcus runs things now, and young Mr. Bell wants you buried so deep the worms won't find you." The news struck like a physical blow, changing everything while changing nothing at all. Bell's death meant the personal vendetta had shifted to someone they'd never met, but the corruption and violence would continue under new management with fresh motivation for revenge. "Ferry's still there," Greta observed, pointing through the trees toward a bobbing lantern near the creek's swollen banks. Nate Harlan's ferry, if the stubborn wheat farmer hadn't fled with his flat-bottomed craft. Their only realistic chance of crossing the torrent before Carr's men could complete their encirclement and finish this fight on terms entirely favorable to superior numbers. "Stay low and follow my lead," Black Wolf instructed both women. "If shooting starts in earnest, find the biggest tree available and make yourself small behind it." They moved through the cottonwoods like ghosts given substance, using storm noise to mask their approach while staying alert for the kind of mistakes that got people killed on the frontier. Black Wolf's moccasins made no sound on wet earth, and both women had learned the quiet that kept you breathing when noise meant death. The ferry belonged to Nate Harlan, just as they'd hoped. The weathered farmer stood beside his lantern, checking rope guides that kept his crude craft from being swept downstream by the current's relentless power. His lined face showed relief when he recognized the approaching figures. "Figured you might show up," Nate said, without wasting words on elaborate greetings. "Carr's boy's been through town twice tonight, asking pointed questions and making threats. Didn't much care for their manner." Behind them, voices carried on the wind as their pursuers worked downstream along the creek bank, methodically checking every hiding place with professional thoroughness that would eventually lead them to this exact spot. "Can you get us across?" Black Wolf asked. Nate studied the raging water with a farmer's eye for natural forces beyond human control. "Current's strong enough to flip us end over end if I'm not careful with the pole, but she'll hold together if we're quick about the crossing." They climbed aboard the ferry's wet planks, just as rifle flashes lit the trees behind them. Carr's men had found their trail and were closing distance fast, no longer concerned with stealth or subtlety now that their quarry was in sight. Nate threw his full weight against the ferry pole muscles, straining as he fought current that wanted to sweep them downstream into the cottonwood snags and debris fields. The crude craft lurched away from shore just as the first bullets began to fly lead, plunging into churning water like deadly hail. Black Wolf knelt at the ferry's downstream edge, returning fire with careful shots designed to keep their attackers' heads down, rather than score killing hits across moving water in darkness. The Colt's cylinder clicked empty after 3 rounds, but those seconds of covering fire allowed Nate to gain crucial distance from the bank. Winona lay flat on the planks, her Winchester speaking with methodical precision as she placed shots just close enough to make Carr's men duck for cover. She wasn't attempting impossible marksmanship in these conditions, just enough accuracy to discourage reckless charges across open water. A lucky bullet caught Black Wolf high on his left shoulder, spinning him halfway around and sending fire down his entire arm. Pain lanced through muscle and bone, but he kept his grip on the empty revolver while warm blood began to soak his shirt. Greta immediately crawled to his side, her medical training overriding any concern for the bullets whistling overhead. "How bad?" she asked, pressing her palm against the wound to assess damage. "I'll live," he replied through gritted teeth, though his face had gone pale beneath its bronze coloring. "Clean through the muscle, feels like." She tore a strip from her chemise, the fabric parting with a soft sound, barely audible over gunfire and rushing water. Her fingers were gentle but efficient as she wrapped the makeshift bandage around his shoulder, working by touch in the storm-lit darkness. "Hold still," she murmured, their faces close, as she secured the binding with movements that spoke of extensive experience with battlefield wounds. "Need to slow this bleeding before you lose too much." The ferry bumped against the opposite shore with enough force to knock them all sideways, timbers groaning as the craft fought current and rope guide simultaneously. Nate hauled on the mooring line with his face set in grim concentration. "Off," he commanded tersely, "before the current takes us downstream to the snags." They stumbled onto muddy ground as another volley of shots peppered the water behind them, muzzle flashes reflecting off the creek's surface like fallen stars. On the far shore, Carr's men were already mounting up and looking for another crossing point that might or might not exist in the flood-altered landscape. "Mills that direction." Nate pointed toward a dark bulk against the storm-lit horizon. "Old Henrik's got thick stone walls and a clean field of fire if you can make it that far." Dr. Ezra Pike met them at the mill's heavy oak door, his medical bag already in hand, and his expression showing the controlled urgency of someone who'd treated everything from arrow wounds to childbed fever in 2 decades of frontier practice. At 40, the country physician moved with economical precision, born of experience with emergencies. "Inside quickly," he said, ushering them into the grinding room where massive millstones sat silent in the lamplight. "I heard the shooting from here. How many wounded?" "Just me," Black Wolf said, though his voice lacked its usual strength, and his face had gone the color of old parchment. Dr. Pike examined the shoulder wound by lamplight, his touch professional but thorough as he probed for bone chips or arterial damage. "Clean through the muscle tissue. Painful, but not immediately dangerous if we prevent infection." He reached for a bottle of whiskey. "This will hurt considerably." The alcohol burned like liquid fire poured directly onto exposed nerve endings, but Black Wolf didn't flinch or cry out. Greta held clean cloth ready while the doctor worked, their movements coordinated as if they'd collaborated on similar procedures before. "You 3 are in considerable legal trouble," Dr. Pike observed as he began stitching the wound closed with practiced efficiency. "Bell's dead by his own hand, but his nephew has already filed charges with the territorial marshal. Claims you murdered his uncle and stole a fortune in mining gold." "What kind of evidence does Marcus Bell claim to have?" Winona asked. "Witnesses who allegedly saw you planning the robbery. Documents showing payments to supposed accomplices. He even claims to have recovered some of the stolen gold from your possessions, though I notice you're not carrying any strong boxes full of nuggets." "All fabrications," Greta said firmly. "We never stole anything from Bell or anyone else." "Of course they are, but lies told by expensive lawyers in territorial courts tend to carry more weight than truth spoken by people without political connections." The doctor tied off his stitches and reached for clean bandages. "Your only chance is finding evidence that proves Bell's actual crimes before his nephew can have you arrested and tried." Through the mill's small windows, they could see lights moving across the flooded landscape as searchers spread out through the night. Carr's men had found their crossing and were methodically working through every possible hiding place in the area. "There might be something," Winona said slowly, her voice thoughtful. "Mrs. Vale mentioned seeing additional papers in the school records, a complete ledger that could contain everything we need to prove Bell's guilt." "Where would such records be kept?" Black Wolf asked. "The bell tower. She saw Carr climbing up there just before the worst flooding hit. Might have been hiding evidence where he thought rising water couldn't reach it." Black Wolf considered the tactical situation with a warrior's eye for calculated risks. The tower was accessible but dangerous, especially with the building partially flooded and armed men hunting them throughout the area. But without solid proof of Bell's crimes, they were fighting ghosts with empty hands. "We'll need a significant distraction," he decided. something loud and visible enough to draw attention away from the schoolhouse long enough for a search. "What kind of distraction?" Dr. Pike asked. "The kind that lights up the sky and keeps people busy fighting fires instead of hunting fugitives." Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken as it moved eastward, leaving behind steady rain that drummed on the mill's roof with hypnotic persistence. Dawn was perhaps 4 hours away, time enough to attempt their mission if they could reach the schoolhouse undetected. "I know another route back to town," Nate offered. "Old Buffalo Trail that follows high ground above the flood line. Takes longer than the direct road, but it'll keep you clear of the main approaches where cars likely posted sentries." They prepared to leave the mill's relative safety, each understanding that their slim chance of survival depended on reaching the hidden evidence before Bell's men could destroy it. The schoolhouse bell tower had become both their potential salvation and probable tomb. Black Wolf reloaded his revolver with cartridges Dr. Pike provided from his own supplies, checking each chamber carefully before holstering the weapon. 5 shots against unknown numbers of professional gunmen, inadequate firepower, but better than facing them empty-handed. Winona slung her Winchester across her back and distributed spare ammunition between her vest pockets, her movements economical and professional. She'd positioned herself as their rear guard, responsible for watching their back trail and covering any necessary retreat. Greta repacked her medical supplies with items from Dr. Pike's stores, adding bandages and antiseptic solutions that might prove crucial in the hours ahead. She understood her role as the group's medical officer, responsible for keeping the others functional long enough to complete their mission. The mill door opened with a creak that seemed to echo across the prairie despite the wind and rain. Outside, the night waited with patient malevolence, full of hidden weapons and men willing to use them for territorial politics and blood money. But they possessed something Bell's hired killers lacked: absolute trust in each other and the kind of desperate courage that came from having nothing left to lose except their lives and their chance for justice. In a territory where power usually trumped truth, 3 people had chosen to make their stand for what was right rather than what was profitable. The Buffalo Trail wound through broken country above the flood's reach, offering concealment at the cost of treacherous footing in near-total darkness. Black Wolf led despite his wounded shoulder, his night vision and tracking skills making him the logical choice to navigate hazardous terrain where a single misstep could mean a fatal fall. Behind him, Winona moved with the fluid grace of someone born to this harsh land, her moccasined feet finding purchase on wet stones that would have defeated less experienced travelers. She'd positioned herself to support Black Wolf if his injury weakened him, ready to assume leadership if circumstances demanded. Greta brought up the rear, her determination, overcoming relative inexperience with frontier travel. The medical bag slung across her shoulder represented both her profession and her commitment to preserving life in a land that seemed dedicated to destroying it at every opportunity. "Light ahead," Black Wolf whispered, pointing toward a faint glow that marked the schoolhouse's position in the flooded town below. They could see the building clearly now, its upper floors still above water, but listing slightly from foundation damage caused by the flood's relentless assault. The bell tower rose like an accusing finger pointed at storm clouds that continued to flicker with distant lightning. Around the schoolhouse, several campfires marked where Carr's search teams had established a loose perimeter. The men were being methodical, rather than hasty, checking every structure and hiding place with the patience of professionals who understood that carelessness led to empty hands and disappointed employers. 5 men visible. Winona observed, studying enemy positions with a scout's eye for tactical details. Probably more inside the building itself, and possibly additional sentries we can't see from this angle. "We need them focused somewhere else entirely," Black Wolf said. "Draw their attention away long enough to search the tower without interference." "What did you have in mind?" He pointed toward the livery stable, a wooden structure that stood partially submerged but still intact despite the flood's best efforts. Fire. Something big and bright enough to get their attention and keep it occupied while we work. It was a desperate gamble built on hope and necessity, but desperation had become their most reliable companion since this nightmare began. They worked their way around to the stable's back wall, where broken boards provided access to the hay-filled interior that would burn like a torch once ignited. The dry straw caught quickly, despite ambient moisture flames racing up the walls and through the loft with hungry enthusiasm that spoke of months without significant rainfall. Within minutes, the entire structure was ablaze, sending a column of smoke and sparks high into the night sky like a beacon visible for miles. The distraction worked with satisfying completeness. Carr's men rushed toward the conflagration shouting orders and organizing bucket brigades to prevent flames from spreading to other buildings and turning the entire town into a funeral pyre. The schoolhouse stood temporarily unguarded, its bell tower waiting like a promise of either salvation or damnation. They reached the building through a broken window on the side facing away from the fire, wading through knee-deep water that filled the lower floor with a soup of floating debris, dissolved mud, and items too waterlogged to identify. The familiar classroom had been transformed into something from a fever dream, with desks and chairs floating like corpses in a flooded cemetery. The bell tower was accessible through a narrow ladder that rose from the second floor to a cramped chamber beneath the bronze bell itself. Black Wolf climbed first, his wounded shoulder protesting every rung with sharp reminders of his injury, while Winona and Greta waited below to cover his retreat if Carr's men returned prematurely. The tower chamber was cramped and dusty, illuminated only by lightning flashes that revealed a space designed for purely functional purposes. But tucked behind the bell's iron mounting bracket wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture was exactly what they'd hoped to find: a leather-bound ledger, thick with pages covered in Bell's meticulous handwriting. Account entries, payment schedules, and correspondence that detailed a criminal enterprise spanning years and reaching into the highest levels of territorial government like a cancer that had metastasized beyond any hope of surgical removal. But it was a personal letter tucked inside the front cover that made Black Wolf's blood freeze in his veins. Written in Bell's careful script and addressed to Wade Carr, it contained explicit instructions for eliminating complications that threatened their profitable operations. Dispose of the school clerk and the midwife. It read in precise businesslike language. They have asked too many inconvenient questions about missing funds and suspicious deaths. Make their endings appear accidental drowning would be seasonally appropriate. Payment as previously arranged. C. Bell. Clara Vale. Mrs. Vale's sister, who had vanished 6 months ago, had been murdered on Bell's direct orders, as had Martha Hollis, the midwife whose body had been discovered by the creek before the flood struck. Both women had died for the crime of asking inconvenient questions about Bell's fraudulent schemes and the mysterious disappearances that seemed to follow in their wake. A folded paper fell from between the ledger's pages as Black Wolf carefully made his way down from the tower chamber. Winona picked it up with hands that trembled slightly, her face going pale as she read the contents by flickering lightning. "My parents," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Joseph and Marie Crow Feather. They're listed here among Bell's eliminated complications from 5 years past." The truth struck like a physical blow to the chest, driving breath from lungs and hope from hearts. Bell hadn't merely been stealing money and filing fraudulent insurance claims, he'd been systematically murdering anyone who threatened to expose his criminal enterprise. Winona's parents had been among his victims, killed not by disease or accident as she'd been told, but by assassins acting on Bell's written orders. "We have him," Greta said fiercely, reading over their shoulders with growing outrage. "This evidence is enough to hang a dozen men and expose corruption reaching into the territorial capital." Through the schoolhouse windows, They could see that the stable fire was beginning to burn itself out, having consumed most available fuel. Carr's men would return to their search pattern soon, and their window of opportunity was closing with the relentless precision of a trap springing shut. They made their way back through the flooded building, the precious ledger wrapped in Greta's medical bag, to protect it from water damage that could destroy their only hope for justice. Behind them, voices were already returning to the schoolhouse area as the fire brigade declared victory over the flames. But their escape route was blocked by an unpleasant surprise. Wade Carr himself stood in the doorway they'd used for entry, his rifle trained on the exact spot where they would have to appear. His weathered face showed the grim satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered dangerous prey after a long and difficult chase. "Hello there, old friend," he said to Black Wolf with mock cordiality. "I was wondering when you'd show up to play hero, though I confess disappointment at seeing what kind of company you're keeping these days." "Wade." Black Wolf replied, his voice carefully neutral despite the rage building in his chest. "Still taking blood money from men who murder women and children for asking inconvenient questions, I see." Bell paid exceptionally well, and he always kept his promises to loyal employees. Unlike certain people I could mention who abandoned profitable partnerships for the sake of misguided conscience. Carr's grip on his rifle never wavered, professional competence evident in every line of his body. The reference to their shared past hung in the storm-charged air like smoke from the dying fire. Black Wolf and Carr had indeed been partners, once young men seeking gold in the Black Hills before the Indian Wars made such dreams impossible to pursue. But they'd parted ways over matters of principle, specifically Carr's willingness to murder fellow prospectors for their claims had been more than Black Wolf's conscience could tolerate. That was 15 years ago, Wade. Time to let old grievances die and be buried. Some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness, and some insults demand satisfaction regardless of time's passage. Carr's voice carried the weight of long-nursed resentment. "You cost me a fortune when you rode away from our Deadwood partnership. I've been owed payback ever since." Behind Carr, two more of Bell's hired guns appeared in the doorway, their rifles adding to the tactical disadvantage facing the cornered fugitives. The odds were becoming increasingly unfavorable with each passing moment. "The ledger," Carr continued with businesslike directness. "Hand it over without drama, and perhaps the women live long enough to face territorial justice instead of summary execution." "What ledger would that be?" Black Wolf asked with feigned innocence. Carr's laughter was harsh and devoid of any warmth or humor. "Please, don't insult what intelligence I possess. Bell's complete records were hidden in that tower for excellent reasons, evidence of every crime, every payment, every witness who required elimination. Marcus Bell wants those records destroyed permanently, and he's offering a substantial bonus for their delivery." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring under tension, three people with everything to lose facing armed men with nothing to gain except money and their employer's continued favor. In that electrically charged moment, violence seemed as inevitable as sunrise following the darkest night. Then everything changed in the space between heartbeats. Winona moved with the fluid speed that had kept her alive through countless dangerous situations, her Winchester coming off her shoulder and into firing position before Carr could react to the threat. The rifle spoke with authority, its heavy bullet taking one of Carr's men in the shoulder and spinning him around like a broken toy. Black Wolf dove sideways as Carr's shot missed his head by inches, the bullet splintering wood where he'd been standing moments before. He rolled behind an overturned desk while drawing his Colt muscle memory overriding conscious thought in the deadly chaos of close-quarters combat. Greta dropped flat to the flooded floor and crawled toward better cover, clutching the medical bag containing their precious evidence against her chest like a shield. Inside that leather satchel lay their only hope for justice and their ticket to survival, if they lived long enough to present it to an honest judge. The gun battle that followed was brief, but savage, fought in confined space with desperate intensity by people who understood that defeat meant death or worse. Rifles cracked and pistols barked in the flooded schoolhouse muzzle flashes, strobing like lightning as combatants fought for position and advantage. Winona worked her Winchester with mechanical precision, each shot placed with the accuracy that came from years of hunting game that possessed the unsporting habit of shooting back. Carr's second gunman went down with a bullet through his thigh, his screams echoing off the schoolhouse walls before being swallowed by storm noise. Black Wolf's Colt answered Carr's rifle shot for shot, neither man able to gain decisive advantage in the chaotic firefight that followed. They'd fought together against Sioux war parties in younger days, and both knew the other's tactics too well for either to achieve quick victory through superior skill alone. But numbers favored Bell's forces, and ammunition supplies favored whoever had planned for an extended siege. Black Wolf's revolver clicked empty after his fifth shot, leaving him momentarily defenseless, while he fumbled for loose cartridges with hands made clumsy by adrenaline and blood loss. Carr rose from cover with predatory confidence, his rifle trained on his former partner's chest for a killing shot that would end their long-delayed reckoning. "Should have accepted my generous offer, old friend. Now everyone dies badly." The shot that ended the standoff came from an entirely unexpected direction. "Doctor." Pike appeared in the doorway behind Carr's position, a smoking double-barreled shotgun in his hands and grim determination written across his weathered features. "Drop your weapon, Carr," the physician commanded with quiet authority. "Your employer is dead. His nephew's reign of terror ends tonight, and you're outnumbered by people who've had enough of Bell family justice." Carr spun toward this new threat, but Winona's Winchester spoke first and final. The heavy slug caught him center mass with enough force to lift him off his feet and send him crashing into the schoolhouse wall. He slid down slowly, leaving a dark stain on wet wood, his rifle falling from fingers that would never again pull a trigger. The surviving gunman threw down his weapon and raised both hands high above his head, displaying enough intelligence to recognize when a fight was truly finished. Blood and gunpowder smoke hung in the air like incense at a funeral service for Bell's criminal empire. "Is everyone still breathing?" Dr. Pike asked, lowering his shotgun with obvious relief. "We're alive and functional." Black Wolf replied, reloading his Colt with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline rather than fear. "And we've got evidence that will prove Bell's crimes beyond any reasonable doubt." Greta opened her medical bag with reverent care and produced the ledger, its oiled wrapping having protected it from water damage during the violent encounter. The book seemed to pulse with accusatory power in the uncertain light, promising justice for the innocent dead. "Then let's get it to someone with authority to act on what it contains," Dr. Pike said pragmatically. "Judge Harrison should be in Red Butte for the quarterly cattle auction. If we can reach him before Marcus Bell does, we might actually see justice done in this territory." Outside, the storm was finally breaking apart as it moved eastward toward distant mountains. Dawn remained hours away, but the absolute darkness of midnight was yielding to lesser shadows that preceded sunrise. They had perhaps a 4-hour head start before Marcus Bell learned of their success and moved to counter it with whatever resources remained at his disposal. 4 hours to cover 20 miles of treacherous country and present their evidence to a federal judge who might or might not prove honest enough to act against entrenched territorial corruption. The race had begun in earnest, and the stakes were nothing less than justice itself, weighed against the kind of power that had murdered entire families for profit. They gathered what supplies they could carry and prepared to abandon the schoolhouse that had served as both sanctuary and battlefield. Behind them, Wade Carr's body lay in the flooded ruins, a grim reminder that some partnerships couldn't survive the corrupting influence of easy money and blood debts. Ahead stretched the open prairie, and their desperate gamble to reach Red Butte before Belle's remaining allies could destroy them or discredit their evidence. The ledger in Greta's bag contained truth, but truth was a fragile commodity in a territory where influence often mattered more than facts. As they stepped into the pre-dawn darkness, each privately acknowledged that their chances of living to see another sunset were questionable at best. But they'd committed themselves to this path, now bound together by shared danger and stubborn refusal to let Belle's crimes remain unpunished. Whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them as one. The ferry crossing proved treacherous in the storm's aftermath, with Nate Harlan poling them across water that ran swift and debris-laden from the night's torrential rainfall. His flat-bottomed craft groaned under the current's relentless pressure rope guide singing with tension as they fought to maintain proper course toward the opposite bank. "Currents running fierce as a rabid wolf." Nate grunted through clenched teeth, throwing his full weight against the ferry pole. "River's got a powerful hunger tonight, and she's not particular about what she swallows." Behind them, Ghost Hollow flickered with scattered lantern light as remaining searchers discovered Carr's body and realized their quarry had slipped through their net once again. Soon, those lights would be moving with renewed purpose, following whatever trail signs survived the flood and storm. Black Wolf's shoulder wound throbbed with each heartbeat, the injury stiffening despite Greta's careful field dressing. Fever was building in his blood like an unwelcome guest, but there was neither time nor opportunity for proper rest and recovery. They had to reach Red Butte before Marcus Bell could corrupt the legal process beyond any hope of redemption. "How far by direct route?" Greta asked, studying Black Wolf's increasingly pale complexion with clinical concern that didn't quite mask deeper worry. 15 miles if we follow the main territorial road," Nate replied between pole strokes. "But that's exactly where they'll expect you to go, and it's too exposed for people in your particular situation. Better to take the high country route despite the extra distance." "Can you guide us through unfamiliar terrain?" "Part of the way, at least. These old bones aren't suited for 20-mile night rides anymore, but I can set you on the proper trail and give directions for the rest." The ferry scraped against the far shore with enough jarring force to knock all passengers sideways against the craft's low railings. Nate secured the mooring rope while his passengers prepared to continue their desperate flight toward uncertain sanctuary. Horses waited in his barn, 4 sturdy animals selected for endurance rather than speed, the kind of frontier stock that could cover significant ground on minimal water and poor forage. Nate's personal mount was a rangy gelding with the deep chest and strong legs that marked a horse bred for long-distance travel across difficult country. Black Wolf's assigned horse was a paint mare with intelligent eyes and the steady temperament that might mean survival on treacherous night trails. The animal stood quietly while he checked saddle rigging with movements hampered by his wounded shoulder, but still competent through years of experience. Winona received a compact buckskin that reminded her of horses from her childhood prairie-bred stock, with the kind of stamina that came from generations of natural selection in harsh conditions. The animal accepted her, immediately recognizing an experienced rider who understood the partnership between human and mount. Greta's horse was a gentle bay mare with white stockings chosen more for reliability than spirit or speed. She possessed adequate riding skills rather than natural horsemanship, but the mare would compensate for her limitations if given proper guidance and encouragement. "Follow the ridge trail until you sight the red bluffs," Nate instructed as they prepared to depart into darkness. "Then cut down through Devil's Canyon. It's treacherous country, but it'll put you on Red Butte's backside, well away from the main approaches where Belle's people might be watching." "What about you and Sarah?" Black Wolf asked, recognizing the risk the wheat farmer was taking by helping them. "We'll hold down the homestead and misdirect any visitors who come asking inconvenient questions. Tell them we saw suspicious riders heading east toward the railroad. Should buy you some additional time to reach Judge Harrison." They clasped hands in the pre-dawn darkness, understanding this might serve as their final farewell. Nate Harlan was risking everything to help virtual strangers, motivated by his own bitter experience with Bell's corrupt practices and his respect for people willing to fight for justice, regardless of personal cost. The Ridge Trail proved every bit as challenging as advertised: narrow, treacherous, and nearly invisible in conditions that tested both horses and riders to their limits. But it also provided the concealment they desperately needed, winding through broken country where pursuit would be difficult and dangerous, even for experienced trackers. Black Wolf rode point despite his injury, his superior night vision and tracking skills making him the logical choice to navigate hazardous terrain where a single navigation error could prove fatal. Behind him, Winona maintained watch on their back trail, while Greta concentrated on staying mounted as her horse picked its way along precipitous ledges. The miles passed with agonizing slowness, measured in careful hoofbeats and controlled breathing, as both animals and riders tested each other's limits of endurance and trust. Conversation was kept to essential warnings about obstacles or directional changes, but awareness of each other remained constant and reassuring. When Black Wolf swayed dangerously in his saddle, weakened by blood loss and mounting fever, Winona was immediately at his side, with a steadying hand on his good arm. When Greta's mount shied at something moving in the underbrush, Black Wolf was there with quiet reassurance and a calming presence that settled both horse and rider. Small gestures, perhaps, but significant ones that spoke of growing bonds deeper than mere temporary alliance. They were becoming something more than companions thrown together by circumstance. They were becoming family. In the truest sense, their individual strengths combining to create resilience greater than any could achieve alone. As false dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon with pale promise, they reached the red sandstone bluffs that marked the halfway point of their journey. The ancient geological formations rose from prairie floor like monuments to geological time, their wind-carved faces creating fantastic shapes that seemed almost deliberately sculptural. Rest stop. Black Wolf decided, finding shelter among the rocks where they could water their horses and assess their situation without being easily spotted from a distance. Greta immediately came to examine his shoulder wound, her touch gentle but thorough as she checked for signs of increasing infection. "The bleeding has stopped, but you're developing significant fever. You need proper medical attention as soon as possible." "After we reach Judge Harrison," he said, though his voice lacked its usual strength and his skin felt hot to the touch. "After we reach the judge," she agreed reluctantly, rebandaging the injury with fresh cloth while her fingers lingered against his skin longer than strict medical necessity required. Winona returned from scouting their back trail with news that chilled them despite the growing warmth of approaching sunrise. "Riders behind us, maybe 3 miles back. At least 4, possibly 6. They're pushing their mounts hard and gaining ground steadily." The mathematics of pursuit were brutally simple and entirely unfavorable. Their horses were tired from hours of difficult travel, while their pursuers had fresh animals and nothing to lose except Marcus Bell's displeasure. Unless something changed dramatically in their favor, they would be overtaken well short of their destination. "Devil's Canyon is our only realistic option," Black Wolf said, studying the terrain ahead with tactical eyes that cataloged both opportunities and dangers. "Risky proposition," Winona observed. "That's maze country where one wrong turn leaves you trapped like a rat in a grain barrel." "But it's terrain that works against superior numbers," he pointed out. "Narrow passages, limited sight lines, plenty of places for ambush if we're forced to make a stand." They mounted up again as the sun cleared the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson that would have been breathtaking under different circumstances. Beauty was a luxury they couldn't afford when survival demanded their complete attention and every resource they possessed. Devil's Canyon earned its ominous reputation through sheer geological malevolence. The entrance was a narrow cleft in red sandstone that barely accommodated a horse and rider, opening without warning into a labyrinthine maze of passages, dead ends, and circular chambers that seemed designed by some mad architect with a hatred of logical navigation. Here, the pursuit became a deadly game of three-dimensional chess played at lethal stakes. Echoing hoofbeats made distance and direction impossible to judge accurately, while the canyon's acoustics turned every sound into potential deception. Black Wolf guided them through the maze, using instinct honed by years of frontier travel, while behind them, their pursuers struggled with identical navigation challenges. The first crisis came without warning. A section of canyon wall, undermined by flood damage and weakened by thermal expansion, chose that moment to surrender to gravity. Tons of sandstone crashed down in a thunderous avalanche that blocked their intended route and sent horses rearing in panic. "Back!" Black Wolf shouted over the rumbling chaos, fighting to control his paint mare as rocks continued to fall around them. "Find another way through." But the alternate passage led them deeper into the canyon's heart, where the walls rose higher and the sky became a narrow ribbon of blue far overhead. Worse, the sound of falling rock would have alerted their pursuers to this general area, drawing them like wolves to wounded prey. The second crisis arrived as they attempted to ford a flash flood channel that hadn't existed on any map, but now carried a torrent of muddy water from overnight storms in the distant mountains. What should have been dry ground had become a raging stream too wide to jump and too deep to cross safely. "We swim for it," Black Wolf decided, though his fever-bright eyes showed the strain of maintaining leadership through increasingly difficult decisions. "The current will sweep us downstream," Greta protested, studying the churning water with obvious apprehension. "Then we get swept together," Winona said grimly, already urging her buckskin toward the water's edge. "Because staying here means getting caught in a trap with no way out." They plunged into the flood together, horses and riders fighting current that tried to separate them and drag them toward the rocky narrows downstream. Black Wolf's wounded shoulder screamed protest as he struggled to maintain his seat while the paint mare swam desperately toward the opposite bank. Greta's bay mare foundered in the middle of the stream, exhausted by the night's travel and overwhelmed by the raging current. Horse and rider began to slip downstream toward certain death among the rocks and rapids that marked the canyon's deadly heart. Without hesitation, Black Wolf urged his paint into the current's grip, reaching Greta just as her horse lost the battle against the flood. He caught her around the waist, with his good arm hauling her from the drowning mare's back and onto his own mount's hindquarters. "Hold tight." He gasped, his face gray with pain and effort, as fever and blood loss took their toll. She wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing against his back for security, while the paint mare fought valiantly to carry double weight against the murderous current. Her medical bag, heavy with water and precious evidence, dragged at her shoulder like an anchor, threatening to pull them both to watery graves. Winona had already reached the far shore and was working her way downstream along the bank, her rope ready to assist if their situation became hopeless. "This way," she called, pointing toward a spot where the current might carry them within reach of safety. The paint mare touched bottom with her hooves, just as her strength gave out completely. She stumbled up the muddy bank on trembling legs, carrying her double burden to solid ground before collapsing in exhaustion. Black Wolf slid from the saddle and nearly fell his wounded shoulder, no longer capable of supporting his weight. "Both of you off," Greta commanded with medical authority, examining the mare's condition while water streamed from her sodden clothing. "This horse needs rest, and you need immediate attention before that fever kills you." But they had no time for proper rest or medical care. The sound of hoofbeats was growing closer, echoing off canyon walls in ways that made precise location impossible, but suggested their pursuers were closing the distance with methodical determination. There, Winona pointed toward a narrow side passage that climbed steeply toward the canyon rim. If we can reach high ground, we might find a way out of this maze. They abandoned the exhausted paint mare with genuine regret, redistributing essential supplies among the two remaining horses. Greta insisted on carrying her medical bag, despite its waterlogged weight, while Black Wolf retained the precious ledger that represented their only hope for justice. The climb out of Devil's Canyon tested their remaining strength to its absolute limits. The trail, if it could be called that, was little more than a series of natural ledges and handholds carved by wind and weather into the sandstone face. One misstep would mean a fatal fall to the rocks below. Black Wolf led the ascent, despite his deteriorating condition, his experience with difficult terrain making him their best hope for finding a route to the rim. Behind him, Winona and Greta followed with the two remaining horses, coaxing the frightened animals up slopes that seemed impossible for four-legged creatures to negotiate. Halfway to the top, Black Wolf's strength finally gave out completely. He collapsed against the rock face, his breathing labored and his skin burning with fever that threatened to cook his brain inside his skull. "Can't," he gasped, unable to finish the sentence. "Yes, you can," Greta said firmly, moving up beside him despite the precarious footing. She pulled a small bottle from her medical supplies and forced him to drink its contents. "Willow bark extract. It'll help with the fever, but you have to keep moving." Winona secured the horses to a sturdy outcropping and joined them on the narrow ledge, her face grim with determination. "I'll take point from here. You help him climb, and I'll find us a way to the top." The final ascent became a nightmare of shared effort and mutual dependence. Winona found handholds and footholds, calling directions back to the others while testing each step for safety. Greta supported Black Wolf when his strength failed, lending him her shoulder and her unwavering determination to see him reach safety. They emerged onto the canyon rim just as the sun reached its zenith, painting the landscape in harsh light that revealed their pursuers' positions far below. 4 riders were working their way through the maze with professional persistence, following their trail with the kind of tracking skills that suggested military or law enforcement background. "How far to Red Butte?" Greta asked, shading her eyes against the brilliant sun. 5 miles across open ground," Winona replied. "No cover, no concealment, and our horses are nearly finished." It would be a race now pure and simple, their exhausted animals against fresh pursuit across terrain that offered no advantages to either side. Everything would depend on endurance, determination, and whatever luck they could muster for one final sprint to sanctuary. Red Butte rose from the prairie like a sleeping giant, its distinctive profile clearly visible against the afternoon sky. But between them and potential safety lay 5 miles of grassland that might as well have been 50 for all the protection it offered from skilled marksmen with adequate rifles. They spurred their horses into a ground-eating lope, the best pace their mounts could sustain across the remaining distance. Behind them, dust clouds marked where their pursuers had found another way out of the canyon and were beginning their own race toward the territorial courthouse. The cattle auction was in full swing when they thundered into Red Butte's main street, drawing startled looks from merchants and cattlemen who stepped aside to avoid being trampled. The courthouse stood at the town's center, an imposing brick structure with white columns that proclaimed the majesty of federal justice in a lawless territory. Black Wolf slid from his saddle and nearly collapsed his strength, finally exhausted by the long flight and mounting fever. Greta caught him around the waist, supporting his weight, while Winona covered their rear with the Winchester held ready for immediate use. "Judge Harrison," Black Wolf called to the crowd gathering on the courthouse steps, his voice hoarse but carrying. "We need to see Judge Harrison immediately." A tall man in judicial robes stepped forward, his bearing and dress marking him as someone accustomed to authority and respect. Judge Samuel Harrison was perhaps 50 years old, with iron-gray hair and the weathered face that came from decades of circuit riding through frontier settlements, where law was often a theoretical concept. "I am Judge Harrison," he said, studying the muddy, exhausted riders with sharp eyes that missed few details. "What brings you here in such apparent distress?" Black Wolf pulled the oiled packet from inside his shirt, the precious ledger somehow having survived flood gunfight and canyon crossing. "Evidence." He managed his voice weakening as fever and blood loss finally overwhelmed his constitution. "Against the Bell criminal organization, murder, fraud, corruption reaching into the territorial capital itself." The ledger hit the courthouse steps with the sound of justice finally arriving after a long and dangerous journey. Papers scattered in the afternoon breeze, some still bearing water stains from their harrowing escape, all containing the truth that powerful men had killed to suppress. Judge Harrison bent to collect the documents, his expression growing increasingly grave as he read Bell's careful handwriting and detailed records of criminal enterprise. Behind him, the crowd murmured and shifted, sensing drama, but not yet comprehending its full scope or significance. "These are extremely serious allegations," the judge said slowly, his legal mind already parsing evidence with trained precision. "Do you have corroborating witnesses? Additional proof that supports these claims?" "We are the witnesses," Winona said, her voice steady, despite exhaustion that threatened to buckle her knees. "And those papers contain detailed records of crimes spanning many years." Commotion at the street's far end announced the arrival of their pursuers, who rode into town with weapons drawn but held ready rather than aimed. Even Marcus Bell's hired guns possessed enough sense not to start a shooting war in front of a federal judge and 50 potential witnesses. The lead rider was a well-dressed man in his 30s, with the kind of confidence that came from Eastern education and unlimited financial resources. This had to be Marcus Bell, the nephew who'd inherited his uncle's criminal empire, along with its murderous obligations and territorial influence. "Judge Harrison," Marcus called with manufactured respect that didn't quite conceal underlying arrogance. "Those 3 fugitives are wanted criminals who murdered my uncle and stole a substantial fortune in mining gold from our legitimate operations." "Interesting claim," Judge Harrison replied with judicial neutrality. "I see no evidence of stolen gold, only some documents and 3 people who appear to have endured considerable hardship." Dr. Pike emerged from the courthouse's interior, accompanied by Mrs. Agnes Vale and several other Ghost Hollow residents who'd traveled to Red Butte specifically to testify about Bell family crimes. Their presence sent a surge of hope through the exhausted fugitives who'd fought so hard to reach this moment. "Your Honor," Dr. Pike said with formal courtesy, "I can personally vouch for these people's character and their version of recent events. Mrs. Vale possesses additional evidence regarding the Bell family's criminal activities." Mrs. Vale stepped forward with her schoolteacher's dignity intact, despite muddy clothes and obvious fatigue. "Those documents contain correspondence between Cyrus Bell and various territorial officials detailing a systematic conspiracy to defraud insurance companies and eliminate witnesses to their crimes. Including my sister Clara," she added, her voice breaking slightly with grief and anger. "Murdered 6 months ago for asking inconvenient questions about missing school funds and suspicious deaths." The crowd continued growing as word spread through Red Butte about the unprecedented legal drama unfolding on the courthouse steps. Cattlemen, businessmen, and ordinary citizens gathered to witness what promised to be the most significant proceeding the territory had seen in years. Judge Harrison continued reading through the evidence with meticulous care, his trained legal mind cataloging each document's contents and cross-referencing testimonies with the kind of attention to detail that separated competent jurists from political appointees. The ledger painted a comprehensive picture of corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government, like a cancer that had metastasized beyond hope of surgical removal. Payment schedules, elimination orders, and detailed records of fraudulent insurance claims created an undeniable pattern of criminal enterprise. "Mr. Bell," Judge Harrison said suddenly, looking past the crowd toward where Marcus sat his horse with growing unease. "These documents appear genuine, and they detail activities that, if proven accurate, would constitute serious federal crimes. How do you respond to these specific allegations?" Marcus Bell's composure began to crack under direct judicial scrutiny and the weight of evidence he'd hoped to suppress before it could reach honest authority. "Your Honor, those papers are obvious forgeries created by desperate criminals seeking to deflect attention from their own crimes." "Forgeries of your uncle's distinctive handwriting?" the judge inquired mildly. "Including personal correspondence that references details only he would have known. My uncle was a respected businessman who ordered the murders of at least a dozen innocent people." Winona interrupted, producing another document from the ledger's depths. "Including my parents, Joseph and Marie Crowfeather, killed 5 years ago for asking questions about fraudulent mining claims." The revelation struck the assembled crowd like a physical blow, causing several people to step back from Marcus Bell as if his guilt might prove contagious. Others moved closer to the courthouse steps in obvious support of the accusers and their quest for justice. Judge Harrison examined the additional evidence with growing concern and professional interest. "This appears to be a comprehensive record of criminal activity, complete with kill orders and payment schedules for what can only be described as assassination services. I demand to see proof of these outrageous accusations," Marcus said desperately, his carefully maintained facade beginning to crumble under legal pressure. "The proof is right here," Judge Harrison replied, holding up the ledger for all to see. "Detailed records in your uncle's handwriting, corroborated by multiple witnesses and supported by physical evidence. Mr. Bell, I'm afraid I must order your detention pending a full federal investigation." The morning sun climbed higher as the impromptu trial continued on the courthouse steps, drawing spectators from throughout the region who'd heard rumors of the proceedings. Judge Harrison examined each piece of evidence with the meticulous care that had earned him a reputation for fairness and competence. Dr. Pike testified about suspicious deaths in Ghost Hollow, including Martha Hollis and Clara Vale, both showing clear signs of violence despite official rulings of accidental death. His medical expertise lent credibility to claims that might otherwise have been dismissed as speculation. Mrs. Vale provided specific details about missing school funds and the questions her sister had been asking before her disappearance. Her testimony was precise and unembellished, carrying the weight of personal loss and intimate knowledge of local affairs. Winona spoke about the insurance fraud scheme with the authority of someone who'd seen the evidence firsthand, describing how Bell's organization had staged fake robberies and attacks to justify fraudulent claims for property that had never been stolen or damaged. Through it all, Marcus Bell maintained his innocence with decreasing conviction, his expensive lawyers notably absent when their services were most desperately needed. The weight of evidence and public opinion was shifting inexorably against him, with each passing hour. "The court finds sufficient evidence to warrant formal federal charges," Judge Harrison announced finally, his voice carrying the authority of territorial law. "Marcus Bell, you are hereby ordered to remain in custody pending complete investigation. Your associates will surrender their weapons and submit to questioning." The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs and scattered applause, while Marcus Bell's face went white with shock and barely contained rage. His hired gunmen looked uncertainly at each other, weighing their loyalty against increasingly poor prospects for survival or profit. "This isn't finished," Marcus said quietly, but loud enough for everyone present to hear clearly. My family has influential friends in Washington. Federal judges can be overruled, evidence can disappear, and witnesses can meet with unfortunate accidents. Mr. Bell. Judge Harrison replied with icy formality that brooked no contradiction. I strongly suggest you concern yourself with finding competent legal representation rather than making threats in open court before federal authority. It was over at last. The desperate race from Ghost Hollow had ended in victory, though the cost had been enormous, and the future remained uncertain in many respects. Black Wolf swayed on his feet as tension finally released its grip on his fevered consciousness. Greta caught him as he started to collapse, her arms strong and certain around his weakening body, despite her own exhaustion. "Easy now," she whispered with gentle authority. "You did it. We all did it together." Winona moved to help support him, and for a moment the three of them stood united on the courthouse steps, bound together by shared danger and mutual dependence that had forged something deeper than temporary alliance. Around them, the machinery of federal justice began to turn as Marcus Bell was taken into custody. But their personal trials were far from over. In a territory where social conventions could be as harsh and unforgiving as the weather itself, three people of different races and backgrounds had forged an alliance that challenged every assumption about how civilized society should function. The question now was whether that alliance could survive the scrutiny and judgment of a world that didn't understand what necessity could create between people who'd learned to trust each other with their lives. Dr. Pike's medical clinic occupied modest quarters behind Red Butte's only hotel, an establishment that catered to traveling judges, cattle buyers, and the occasional territorial official conducting business in the region. Black Wolf lay unconscious on a narrow bed, while Greta monitored his condition with the focused attention of someone who'd learned that death often arrived without dramatic announcement. The shoulder wound had become seriously infected, despite her careful field treatment, and fever ravaged his body as his constitution fought a battle that medical skill could only partially influence. She'd cleaned and redressed the injury, with proper supplies administered what medicines were available, and now could only wait for his body to choose between recovery and surrender. "How is he progressing?" Winona asked from the doorway, her voice carefully controlled but unable to completely mask deeper concern. "Alive, which is more than I expected 12 hours ago," Greta replied with clinical honesty. "The fever should break within the next day, one way or another." Winona entered the small room and took a chair beside the bed, studying Black Wolf's flushed features with eyes that had learned to read sign in human faces as clearly as in disturbed earth. She'd cleaned herself and changed into borrowed clothes, but her expression remained watchful and alert. "Judge Harrison wants to meet with us tomorrow morning," she said quietly. "About what he called legal complications arising from our unusual association." "What sort of complications?" "The kind that develop when three people of different races travel together in a territory where such arrangements are viewed with considerable suspicion." Winona's tone carried the bitter wisdom of experience with frontier prejudices. "Apparently, Marcus Bell's lawyers are claiming our relationship violates territorial morality statutes." Greta nodded slowly, understanding implications that went far beyond simple legal technicalities. Their alliance had been forged in crisis and desperation, but now they faced the more complex challenge of defining their relationship within the constraints of conventional society. "We could separate," she said quietly, though her voice lacked conviction. "Go our different ways, and hope Bell influence doesn't reach far enough to follow individual targets." "We could," Winona agreed with similar lack of enthusiasm. "Question is whether that's what any of us actually wants." It was the conversation they'd been avoiding since immediate danger had passed, and survival was no longer their only consideration. During their flight from Ghost Hollow, staying alive had been the sole priority. Now they had the luxury of choice, and choice carried responsibilities that gunfights didn't require. Black Wolf stirred restlessly, his fever-bright eyes opening to focus on their faces with obvious effort. "Still here," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own labored breathing. "Where else would we be?" Greta asked, smoothing a cool cloth across his forehead with gentle efficiency. "Sensible people would be anywhere but here," he replied, managing a weak smile despite his condition. "This situation isn't going to become easier or more socially acceptable." "Nothing worthwhile ever is easy," Winona observed with pragmatic wisdom earned through hard experience. "Question is whether we believe it's worth the inevitable trouble." They fell silent, each lost in private contemplation of an uncertain future that stretched ahead like unmapped territory. Outside, Red Butte conducted its daily business with the studied normalcy of a community trying to process extraordinary recent events. Judge Harrison entered the clinic with the serious expression of someone preparing to discuss matters that would change lives permanently. He studied the three people gathered around the sickbed with eyes that had learned to see beyond surface appearances to underlying character. "I've spent considerable time reviewing territorial statutes regarding your particular legal situation," he said, without diplomatic preamble. "The Bell family's remaining lawyers are actively pursuing charges of adultery, fornication, and corrupting public morals." "That's completely absurd," Greta said with flat certainty. "We've committed no immoral acts." "Perhaps not by any reasonable standard of judgment," Judge Harrison agreed carefully. "But territorial law unfortunately reflects the prejudices and assumptions of the men who wrote it, and those legislators had very specific ideas about proper relationships between different races and sexes." Black Wolf struggled to sit upright, his face pale, but showing the determination that had carried him through their desperate flight. "What options do we have available?" "Limited and generally unpleasant," the judge admitted, with obvious reluctance. "You could separate completely and scatter to different territories, hoping Bell influence doesn't extend far enough to pursue individual vendettas. Or—" He paused, clearly uncomfortable with the alternative he was about to suggest. "There are certain legal arrangements that might provide protection, though they would create their own complications and social difficulties." "What sort of arrangements?" Winona asked. "Business partnerships, joint property ownership, legal structures that would give you legitimate reasons to live and work together while avoiding the moral charges being threatened." The room fell silent as implications became clear. The judge was suggesting they formalize their relationship through legal contracts rather than marriage, creating a framework that would provide protection while maintaining respectability within territorial law's constraints. "What would that mean in practical terms?" Greta inquired. "You would become business partners in some legitimate enterprise, farming, ranching, medical practice, whatever seems most appropriate to your skills and resources. Legally, you'd be colleagues rather than anything that could be construed as morally questionable." Black Wolf looked from one woman to the other, reading uncertainty and hope in equal measure on both faces. "It's your choice," he said quietly. "Both of you. I won't ask for anything you're not prepared to give freely." "And if we refuse this arrangement?" Winona asked. "Then you face the full weight of territorial law influenced by Bell money and administered by judges who may not share my interest in actual justice over political convenience." It was coercion disguised as legal advice, but Judge Harrison's obvious discomfort suggested he was trying to help rather than manipulate their decision. In a territory where power frequently trumped truth, they needed whatever protection the law could legitimately provide. "How long do we have to make this decision?" Black Wolf asked. "The charges will be filed tomorrow morning unless something changes before then. After that point, the legal process becomes much more expensive and complicated for everyone involved." Judge Harrison left them alone to discuss their limited options. Though all three understood their choices, had been effectively reduced to a single alternative. They could formalize their alliance through legal contracts or spend their remaining lives looking over their shoulders for Belle's remaining agents. "It's not what any of us planned when we woke up that morning in the schoolhouse," Winona said finally. "No," Greta agreed thoughtfully. But then nothing about the past week proceeded according to anyone's plans or expectations. Black Wolf extended his uninjured hand palm upward in a gesture that offered partnership rather than demanded submission. "I can't promise this arrangement will be easy or socially comfortable. I can't even guarantee it will work as intended. But I can promise I'll honor whatever agreement we make." After a long moment of consideration, Winona placed her hand on his, her touch warm and steady, calloused from years of outdoor work, but surprisingly gentle in its pressure. "Safety first," she said quietly. "Then we see what else develops naturally." Greta hesitated only briefly before adding her hand to theirs, her fingers intertwining with both partners in a gesture that felt both practical and deeply personal. "Together, we're stronger than we could ever be separately. We've already proven that beyond any reasonable doubt. Then we see what comes next." Black Wolf agreed, his voice gaining strength despite his physical weakness. Outside, the sun was setting over Red Butte, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded them all of the prairie's harsh beauty and endless possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult adjustments, but tonight they were together, alive and committed to facing whatever trials lay ahead as a united partnership. It wasn't love in any conventional romantic sense, but it was something potentially more valuable and certainly more rare, a genuine alliance based on absolute trust and mutual respect, forged in crisis and tempered by shared danger that had tested them all to their limits. Whether such an arrangement could sustain them through the years ahead remained to be written in the unforgiving ledger of frontier life. But they would face that future together rather than apart. The business arrangement was formalized 3 days later in Judge Harrison's chambers, with Dr. Pike and Mrs. Vale serving as witnesses to what was essentially a legal contract disguised as a commercial partnership. The ceremony was brief and practical, more corporate merger than wedding, but it carried the weight of permanence nonetheless. They established themselves as the Willow Creek Land and Medical Company, with joint ownership of property, shared financial responsibilities, and clearly defined business purposes that satisfied territorial law's requirements for legitimate commercial enterprise. Black Wolf would serve as the company's guide and security specialist, Winona as its surveyor and educational consultant, and Greta as its medical officer and administrative director. The land they chose was located along Willow Creek itself, the same waterway where Belle's strongbox had been buried, and where their desperate alliance had first been tested by gunfire and flood. There was poetic justice in reclaiming that ground as the foundation for their new life together. The homestead they built was modest, but functional, designed around their need for both communal space and individual privacy. Separate sleeping quarters opened onto shared common areas where they could work, eat, and plan their various enterprises without crowding each other beyond tolerance. Work was divided according to ability and inclination, rather than traditional gender roles, creating a household unlike anything their neighbors had ever seen. Black Wolf's reputation as a tracker and guide brought steady income from legitimate surveying parties, cattle buyers, and territorial officials who needed safe passage through potentially dangerous country. Winona established an informal school that operated from their main room, teaching reading and basic mathematics to children whose parents valued education but lacked the skills to provide it themselves. Her fees were modest but reliable, and word of her competence spread quickly through the region. Greta's medical practice flourished as her reputation for skill and compassion grew among frontier families who had few alternatives for professional care. She treated everything from difficult childbirths to gunshot wounds, often traveling considerable distances to reach patients who desperately needed her expertise. Their financial arrangement was entirely communal. All income went into a shared fund that paid for necessities and improvements, with major decisions made collectively rather than by individual authority. It was a practical system that worked because it was based on mutual respect and genuine concern for their common welfare. The social aspects of their relationship evolved more gradually and naturally than any of them had expected. Initial awkwardness gave way to genuine affection as they learned each other's habits, preferences, and private fears. They'd seen each other at their absolute worst and chosen to remain together despite the difficulties. Romance, when it finally developed, came without drama or artificial complications. Black Wolf and Winona were drawn together by shared cultural understanding and complementary skills that made them natural partners in both work and personal matters. His relationship with Greta grew from mutual respect and attraction that deepened gradually into something more substantial and lasting. The triangle was complex but stable, based on the understanding that affection wasn't a finite resource requiring careful rationing or jealous guarding. Each relationship was different and valuable in its own way, contributing to the household's overall strength without creating destructive competition. Greta's bond with Winona proved perhaps the most unexpected development, a deep friendship that satisfied emotional needs neither woman had fully recognized before their partnership began. They shared confidences, supported each other through personal difficulties, and developed an almost telepathic understanding that made them extraordinarily effective as a working team. Letter arrived today. Winona announced one autumn evening, producing an official envelope from the Territorial Postal Service. From Judge Harrison in Cheyenne. The territorial capital was where the larger investigation into Bell family crimes was proceeding, a legal process that had expanded to encompass dozens of defendants and hundreds of individual charges. The corruption their evidence had exposed reached into the highest levels of government, like a cancer that required extensive surgery. "Marcus Bell is dead," she read aloud to her attentive partners. "Killed in his jail cell by another prisoner, apparently someone whose family had been murdered on Bell orders. The remaining defendants are negotiating plea agreements to avoid similar fates or public hangings." It was finished at last. The criminal empire that had terrorized Wyoming Territory for years had finally collapsed under the weight of its own corruption and the evidence they'd risked everything to preserve. Justice had been served, though not in the manner any of them had originally anticipated. "Any mention of the charges they threatened against us?" Greta asked with natural concern. "Dropped completely," Winona replied with obvious satisfaction. "Judge Harrison writes that our testimony was so valuable to the federal investigation that the Territorial Attorney General has issued full pardons for any alleged violations of morality statutes. They were free not just from immediate legal threats, but from the shadow of the Bell organization that had hung over their lives for months, like a storm cloud that refused to break and move on. The future stretched before them, uncertain, but no longer constrained by fear of criminal retribution." "So, what happens now?" Black Wolf asked, voicing the question that had been in all their minds. "Now we live," Greta said with simple certainty. "We build something worth having and worth keeping for ourselves and our community. Together," Winona added with quiet emphasis. "Whatever challenges come next, we face them as partners rather than individuals." Outside their comfortable home, coyotes called across the prairie as they had since the beginning of recorded time, wild voices singing of survival and adaptation under an endless sky that stretched toward horizons none of them could foresee, but all were prepared to explore. Inside, 3 people who'd found love and purpose in the most unlikely circumstances, prepared to build a life that would serve as testament to the power of trust, courage, and the human capacity for unexpected connection across barriers of race culture and social convention. Their story would be whispered around frontier campfires for generations to come, a legend of people who refused to let corruption triumph over justice, who proved that the strongest bonds are forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual respect rather than simple romantic attraction. As seasons turned and years passed, their homestead prospered through shared effort and unwavering commitment to their common enterprise. Children came from miles around to benefit from Winona's teaching. Women traveled great distances to receive Greta's medical care, and men sought Black Wolf's guidance through the dangerous country that surrounded their small corner of civilization. They succeeded not because frontier life was easy or forgiving, but because they faced its challenges as a single unit, their individual strengths combining to create something greater and more resilient than any could have achieved in isolation. In a land that demanded everything and promised nothing in return, they had discovered what every frontier family sought: security, purpose, and the deep satisfaction that comes from meaningful work shared with people you trust absolutely. The schoolhouse bell from Ghost Hollow, salvaged from the flood and installed in their yard, rang each morning to call students to lessons, and each evening to mark another day survived and work completed. Its bronze voice carried across the grassland like a declaration of victory over chaos, corruption, and the kind of despair that destroys communities from within. Sometimes, when the wind was favorable and the moon hung full above the prairie, they would stand together on their porch and listen to that bell's echo rolling toward distant mountains. In those quiet moments, they remembered how far they'd traveled and how much they'd overcome to reach this place of belonging and mutual respect. The frontier had tested them with every trial it could devise: flood and fire bullets and betrayal, legal threats and social condemnation. But they had endured and ultimately triumphed, not merely as individuals, but as a family united by bonds stronger than blood and deeper than conventional passion. Their love story wasn't written in poetry or celebrated in popular ballads. Instead, it was carved into the harsh landscape of Wyoming territory by three people who refused to let the world dictate the terms of their happiness or the structure of their household. It was a practical love earned through shared hardship and proved through mutual sacrifice, but it was genuine and lasting in ways that romantic fantasies could never hope to match. As Black Wolf watched his partners for that's what they truly were, in every sense that mattered, work together to prepare for another harsh winter. He felt the deep contentment that comes from knowing you found your proper place in an often senseless world. Not the place society would have chosen for him, but the place he'd chosen for himself, through courage, perseverance, and unshakable faith in the people who'd stood beside him when everything else had fallen apart. The prairie wind carried the scent of distant snow, promising brutal months ahead that would test their resolve and resources once again. But they were ready, as they'd always been ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring to their door. Together, they were strong enough to weather any storm the world could devise.